The small town of Ashwood Falls had always been a place of quiet routines and tight-knit community bonds. Nestled in the scenic valleys of Oregon, the town's most prominent landmark was the Ashwood Baptist Church, its steeple rising proudly against the backdrop of evergreens. For years, the church had been a sanctuary, a place where locals gathered for worship, comfort, and guidance under the charismatic leadership of Pastor Edward Branston. But as summer waned into the cooler days of autumn, a sense of unease began to settle over the town, and all eyes turned toward the church. Elaine Branston, the pastor's wife, had been missing from the congregation for weeks. Known for her warmth and dedication, she had been an integral part of the church's charitable efforts and its artistic identity. Her murals adorned the sanctuary walls, depicting stories of faith with vibrant colors and a striking emotional depth. Yet now, the woman behind those creations had vanished. No one spoke of it openly at first, but whispers of concern rippled through the pews. It was Helen Porter, a young freelance journalist living a few blocks away, who noticed the first signs that something was amiss. Helen had often admired Elaine, finding her to be a rare blend of creativity and humility. She couldn't ignore the growing absence of the woman who had once brought so much light to the church and the community. One late evening, Helen sat on her porch nursing a cup of tea, when a faint yet distinct chanting drifted through the cool night air. It was coming from the direction of the church. She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. The rhythmic murmurs were accompanied by flickering lights, visible through the tall church windows, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Moments later, a plume of smoke began to rise from behind the church, carrying with it a pungent, acrid smell that made Helen's stomach turn. The following morning, Helen passed by the church during her usual jog. The air was crisp, yet the faint odor of burning lingered. Her gaze fell upon the garden behind the church, where a stone fire pit sat amid the neatly trimmed hedges. Though no smoke rose now, the fire pit bore dark scorch marks, as if it had been used recently. Nearby, the soil appeared disturbed, patches of it freshly turned. She paused briefly, but the stillness of the grounds unsettled her, and she continued on her way. As the days passed, Helen began to observe Edward Branston more closely. He still delivered his Sunday sermons with the same fervor and passion, his voice booming across the sanctuary as he extolled the virtues of faith and sacrifice. Yet there was something different about him, an almost imperceptible tension in his posture, a flicker of unease in his otherwise piercing gaze. When asked about Elaine, Edward offered a consistent explanation. She was on a spiritual retreat, seeking divine guidance at a monastery in the remote wilderness. He assured the congregation that Elaine's absence was temporary, urging them to respect her privacy and pray for her enlightenment. For some, his words were enough to quell their doubts. But for others, including Helen, they raised more questions than answers. Helen's instincts told her there was more to the story. She began keeping notes in her journal, documenting the oddities she had observed: the mysterious chanting, the smoke, the freshly disturbed soil. She noticed subtle changes in Edward's demeanor, from his reluctance to engage in casual conversation to the way he avoided eye contact when Elaine's name was mentioned. Word of Elaine's disappearance began to spread beyond the church walls, reaching the ears of Ashwood Falls' tight-knit community. Neighbors speculated in hushed tones, trading rumors over coffee at the local diner. Some believed Edward's story, trusting the man who had led their spiritual lives for years. Others, like Helen, remained skeptical, their imaginations piecing together darker scenarios. The turning point came when Helen published a blog post titled, "Where is Elaine Branston?" In it, she recounted the peculiarities she had observed, framing her concerns as a plea for answers rather than an accusation. The post quickly gained traction among the townspeople, and soon, whispers turned into outright speculation. Edward's response to the growing scrutiny was swift. During his next sermon, he addressed the congregation with a tone of righteous indignation, decrying the rumors as malicious attacks on the church and his family. He reiterated Elaine's supposed retreat and implored the congregation to stand firm against the forces of doubt and discord. Despite his deflections, Helen remained unconvinced. She spent her evenings poring over old records of the church, searching for any clues that might shed light on Elaine's sudden disappearance. What she uncovered was troubling. Several previous members of the congregation had left abruptly, their departures shrouded in vague explanations. None of them had ever returned to Ashwood Falls. The unease surrounding the church continued to grow. Helen, determined to uncover the truth, began speaking with other members of the congregation, gently probing for details about Elaine's last known activities. Many were reluctant to talk, citing loyalty to Edward and the church, but a few shared glimpses of information. A heated argument between Edward and Elaine overheard after a Sunday service, Elaine's visible distress in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, and her uncharacteristic withdrawal from church events. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, Helen realized she was on the cusp of uncovering something much darker than she had anticipated. Her investigation had begun to attract attention, not all of it welcome. Late one night, she noticed a car idling outside her home, its headlights off, before it sped away into the darkness. The sense of unease deepened. Whatever had happened to Elaine Branston, Helen was certain of one thing. The truth was buried somewhere within the walls of Ashwood Baptist Church, and she was determined to find it. The Ashwood Baptist Church loomed over the small town like a sentinel of tradition and faith. Yet, for Helen Porter, the grand building had become a site of quiet foreboding. Each day, the unanswered questions surrounding Elaine Branston's disappearance grew heavier, and Helen's search for the truth pushed her deeper into the shadows of the church's secrets. Elaine's absence had not gone unnoticed by the community. Many congregants recalled her withdrawal in the weeks before she vanished. Elaine, who once led art workshops and community outreach, had begun canceling events and avoiding gatherings, citing exhaustion. Some remembered seeing her alone late at night, wandering near the church garden, her face pale and drawn as though carrying a weight too heavy to share. These small details trickled through the town like whispers, but no one dared confront the pastor about his wife's disappearance directly. Helen revisited her blog post on Elaine, sifting through the growing number of comments. Most were supportive, urging her to continue seeking answers, but one anonymous remark stood out. "Look beneath the altar. The fire burns the truth away, but the ashes remain." The words unsettled her, hinting at something darker than she had imagined. Determined to follow this lead, Helen decided to investigate the church grounds more thoroughly. Attending Sunday service under the guise of blending in, Helen lingered after the congregation dispersed. She made her way to the garden where the stone fire pit sat at the property's edge. The pit, seemingly ordinary, bore signs of frequent use. Dark scorch marks radiated outward from its edges, as though the flames had once burned uncontrollably. Nearby, the soil appeared recently disturbed. Kneeling discreetly, Helen brushed away the top layer of dirt, her fingers grazing something soft and powdery. It was ash. Carefully collecting a small sample in a tissue, she resolved to have it analyzed. The odor, faint but acrid, lingered in her mind long after she left the church grounds. As Helen straightened, she caught sight of Edward Branston watching her from the church doorway. His piercing gaze was unyielding, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she felt exposed under his scrutiny, as if he could see through her intentions. Forcing a polite wave, she retreated quickly, her pulse racing. Back home, Helen began digging into the church's history. Through local archives, she pieced together Edward Branston's rise to prominence. He had arrived in Ashwood Falls a decade earlier, a traveling preacher with a message of renewal and faith. Charismatic and driven, he had quickly gained a following, using donations to renovate the church and expand its influence. However, not all of his past was so pristine. Helen unearthed articles about former members who had left the congregation under mysterious circumstances. Some cited irreconcilable differences with Edward's teachings, while others simply vanished, their names fading from the town's collective memory. Intriguingly, each departure coincided with large anonymous donations to the church, which were used to fund renovations, including the installation of the sanctuary's stone altar. Helen's unease deepened when she managed to track down Martha Jensen, a former church secretary who had retired 6 months earlier. Martha, a reserved woman in her late 50s, agreed to meet Helen at a local cafe. Over coffee, she revealed that Elaine had confided in her about Edward's increasingly extreme beliefs. According to Martha, Edward had become obsessed with the concept of fire as a means of spiritual purification. He had started conducting private rituals, claiming flames could cleanse impurities of the soul. Elaine was terrified, Martha admitted, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. She told me she didn't recognize Edward anymore. He wasn't the man she married. Martha also disclosed that Elaine had been planning to leave Ashwood Falls. She had packed a small bag containing personal documents, cash, and a notebook she always carried. But the bag stored in the rectory was never retrieved. "She wanted to run," Martha said in a near whisper, "but she never got the chance." Helen took this information to the local police, hoping it would lend weight to her suspicions. The detectives, initially skeptical, began to pay closer attention when Helen presented the ash sample from the fire pit and Martha's testimony. They secured a search warrant for the church grounds, but the results were disappointing. By the time police arrived, the fire pit had been meticulously cleaned, its edges scrubbed of any residue. Inside the rectory, there was no sign of Elaine's belongings. Edward, ever composed, greeted the investigators with unwavering calm. He answered their questions with vague but plausible explanations, insisting that the fire pit was used for harmless community gatherings. When pressed about Elaine's absence, he repeated the familiar narrative of her retreat to a remote monastery. His demeanor was so measured that for a moment, even Helen doubted her suspicions. But as the detectives prepared to leave, one officer noticed a faint, unmistakable odor emanating from beneath the sanctuary floorboards, an odor reminiscent of burned organic material. When questioned, Edward dismissed it as an issue with the old heating system. Undeterred, Helen turned her attention to former congregation members. Many were reluctant to talk, their loyalty to Edward and the church overshadowing their doubts. But one name surfaced repeatedly: Mark Andrews, a former deacon who had left the church under contentious circumstances. Tracking Mark down was a challenge. He had moved to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. When Helen finally reached him, he was hesitant to speak, his eyes darting nervously as if anticipating retribution. "There's a room beneath the sanctuary," Mark finally admitted. "Not everyone knows about it. Edward calls it the purification chamber." Mark described how the chamber, hidden behind the altar, was where Edward conducted his most secretive rituals. He claimed to have witnessed one such ceremony, though he refused to elaborate further. Helen felt a surge of determination. If the chamber existed, it might hold the answers to Elaine's disappearance. Returning to the police with Mark's testimony, Helen urged them to investigate the sanctuary itself. But without direct evidence, the warrant remained limited, and the search revealed nothing unusual. The altar, seemingly immovable, offered no hint of the chamber Mark had described. Edward's grip on the congregation tightened as scrutiny mounted. Loyal members began avoiding Helen, their previous friendliness replaced by cold stares and whispered warnings. The church seemed to close ranks, its walls metaphorically and physically impenetrable. Despite the growing hostility, Helen refused to back down. The ash sample, the disturbed soil, and the cryptic messages all pointed to something deeply wrong within the church. Elaine Branston had not simply disappeared. Helen was certain of it. But proving what had happened and uncovering the truth hidden beneath the altar would take more than determination. It would require exposing the darkest secrets of Ashwood Baptist Church, one step at a time. The Ashwood Baptist Church, with its towering steeple and pristine facade, was becoming the epicenter of Helen Porter's investigation into Elaine Branston's disappearance. The deeper Helen dug, the more the church's sacred walls seemed to hide something sinister. Every step forward revealed new layers of complexity, making the truth feel simultaneously within reach and maddeningly elusive. Helen's suspicion of a hidden chamber beneath the sanctuary had grown since her conversation with Mark Andrews. Despite the police finding nothing unusual during their limited search, Mark's description of a purification chamber resonated too strongly with the evidence she had already uncovered. The ash residue from the fire pit, the faint organic odor beneath the floorboards, and Elaine's unexplained disappearance painted a chilling picture. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that Edward Branston's rituals, shrouded in secrecy and veiled by religious fervor, had crossed a line no one dared to acknowledge. Determined to substantiate Mark's claims, Helen pored over architectural records of the church. At the local library, she unearthed old blueprints dating back to the 1920s, when the sanctuary had been constructed. The plans revealed an unmarked crawl space beneath the main hall, accessible through a trapdoor behind the altar. Though it was listed as a storage area, Helen suspected it had been repurposed. She noted that the renovations funded by Edward a decade earlier had coincided with the disappearance of several former congregation members. The connection was thin but undeniable. Helen's next step was to revisit the church grounds, but the growing hostility from Edward's followers made her cautious. Congregants who once greeted her with warm smiles now avoided her entirely, their eyes darting away as if fearful of being seen speaking to her. A few bolder individuals stared her down with open disdain, whispering among themselves as she passed. The air around the church was charged with suspicion, and Helen realized she was being watched more closely than she had anticipated. She returned late one evening under the cover of darkness to avoid prying eyes. Carrying a flashlight and a small camera, she slipped through the garden and approached the sanctuary. The fire pit, now cold and meticulously cleaned, bore no immediate traces of its sinister past. But as she examined the surrounding soil, Helen found a faint imprint in the dirt, a footprint too large to be Elaine's, leading away from the pit toward the rear entrance of the church. She photographed the footprint, her pulse quickening as she followed its trail. The church doors were locked, but Helen noticed a small side window left ajar. She hesitated, the weight of what she was doing pressing heavily on her conscience. Yet the image of Elaine, vibrant and full of life, pushed her forward. Slipping inside, Helen found herself in the darkened sanctuary. The stillness was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. She moved cautiously toward the altar, her flashlight illuminating the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. The air grew colder as she reached the back, where Mark had claimed the trapdoor was hidden. At first glance, the floorboards appeared seamless, but Helen's meticulous inspection revealed faint scratches along the edges of a rectangular section. Kneeling, she ran her fingers along the grooves, feeling for a latch. Her flashlight caught something metallic, a small recessed handle. With a deep breath, she pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit her immediately, a mix of damp earth, decay, and something acrid that turned her stomach. Helen hesitated, knowing the risk she was taking. Her heart pounded as she descended, each creak of the steps amplifying the suffocating silence. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed a small, windowless room lined with stone walls. The space was stark, save for a crude stone slab in the center that bore scorch marks and dried stains. Surrounding the slab were remnants of burnt objects, charred wood, melted candles, and what appeared to be fragments of fabric. The sight was both surreal and horrifying, the air thick with the echoes of whatever had transpired there. Helen's camera clicked as she documented everything, her hands trembling slightly. The room's sinister purpose was undeniable, and it was clear that Elaine's disappearance was no accident. Helen's flashlight beam swept across the floor, catching a glint of metal near the slab. She knelt to examine it, her breath catching when she realized what it was: a delicate necklace, its chain blackened but intact. It matched the description Martha had given of Elaine's favorite piece of jewelry, one she never removed. The discovery confirmed her worst fears. As Helen prepared to leave, she heard a faint noise above her, a shuffling sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. Someone was in the sanctuary. She quickly extinguished her flashlight, holding her breath as footsteps echoed faintly above. The trapdoor creaked slightly as if someone was testing its weight. Helen remained frozen, her mind racing. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded and silence returned. She waited several minutes before cautiously ascending the stairs, her body tense with anticipation. The sanctuary was empty when she emerged, but Helen didn't linger. Slipping back through the side window, she fled into the night, her camera and the necklace clutched tightly in her hands. As she reached the safety of her car, she felt a surge of relief, quickly replaced by the grim realization of what she had uncovered. Elaine Branston had not simply disappeared. She had been consumed, both figuratively and literally, by the very rituals her husband claimed would bring salvation. Helen's next steps were clear. The evidence she had collected was damning, but it needed to be presented carefully. Edward Branston was not just a man of influence, he was a master manipulator with the unwavering loyalty of his congregation. To expose him, Helen would need not only proof, but also allies willing to challenge his power. The battle for justice was far from over, but Helen knew one thing with absolute certainty. The sanctuary's dark secret was no longer hidden. The light of truth was beginning to pierce through the shadows. The night after her harrowing discovery beneath the Ashwood Baptist Church, Helen Porter could hardly sleep. The images of the stone slab, the charred fragments, and Elaine Branston's scorched necklace lingered in her mind, vivid and horrifying. Her instincts told her she was on the brink of uncovering something much larger than Elaine's disappearance, a web of deceit and manipulation that Edward Branston had spun around his congregation. But Helen also knew she was in dangerous territory. Helen decided to take her findings directly to the police, determined to force them to act. Armed with the photos she had taken and the necklace, she met with Detective Marcus Grayson, a seasoned officer who had grown skeptical of her earlier theories. As she laid out her evidence, Marcus's expression shifted from detached skepticism to grim acknowledgement. The photos of the trap door, the underground room, and the slab were undeniable. The necklace, confirmed to be Elaine's by Martha Jensen's earlier testimony, added weight to Helen's claims. For the first time, the investigation gained momentum. Despite this breakthrough, Edward Branston remained a formidable adversary. When detectives arrived at the church with a warrant to search the sanctuary and its grounds, they were met with fierce resistance. Edward stood at the entrance, flanked by several of his most loyal congregants, their faces grim with determination. He spoke with the calm authority of a leader under siege, accusing the authorities of persecuting the church and violating its sanctity. The scene escalated as members began chanting in unison, creating an atmosphere of defiance that bordered on menacing. Edward's followers, convinced of his divine authority, refused to allow the police entry without a fight. To avoid a public confrontation, the police withdrew temporarily, but Helen knew this delay could give Edward time to destroy further evidence. Her frustration mounted as she realized how deeply entrenched his influence was. She began contacting former members of the congregation, hoping to find someone who could corroborate her discoveries. Many were reluctant to speak, their fear of Edward and his reach palpable. However, one name emerged repeatedly: Anna Caldwell, a woman who had abruptly left the church 3 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Tracking Anna down proved difficult, but Helen's persistence paid off when she located her in a neighboring town. Anna, now living under a different name, was visibly nervous when Helen approached her. Initially hesitant, Anna eventually opened up about her time in the church. She described Edward as a charismatic but increasingly unhinged leader whose obsession with fire rituals had grown dangerous. Anna claimed to have witnessed one such ritual, where Edward burned the belongings of a member he accused of spiritual corruption. Though no one was physically harmed at the time, the act left Anna deeply disturbed. She fled shortly afterward, fearing she might be next. Anna's testimony revealed another chilling detail. Edward had long maintained a secretive inner circle, a group of hand-picked followers who participated in his most extreme practices. These individuals, bound by fear and loyalty, acted as enforcers, ensuring that dissent was silenced and that Edward's orders were carried out without question. Helen realized that this inner circle likely played a key role in Elaine's disappearance and the subsequent cover-up. Determined to find a crack in Edward's facade, Helen revisited Mark Andrews, the former deacon who had told her about the purification chamber. Mark, initially hesitant to speak further, revealed that he had been part of Edward's inner circle before leaving the church. He described the rituals in disturbing detail. Participants were made to chant prayers while Edward performed symbolic cleansings involving fire. Though Mark claimed he had never seen anyone physically harmed, he admitted that Elaine's resistance to Edward's teachings had made her a target. Mark also mentioned a peculiar item Edward kept in his possession, a leather-bound journal that contained detailed records of his rituals and sermons. Mark believed the journal would contain damning evidence about Elaine's fate, but it was always kept locked away in Edward's private office within the rectory. With this information, Helen devised a risky plan to obtain the journal. She knew the rectory would be heavily guarded, especially after the police raid. Enlisting the help of Anna and Mark, Helen orchestrated a diversion. On a quiet evening, as the congregation gathered for a late-night service, Mark staged a minor disturbance at the church's entrance, drawing the attention of Edward and his followers. Meanwhile, Helen and Anna slipped into the rectory through a back entrance. Navigating the dimly lit corridors, Helen found Edward's office. The door was locked, but Anna, who had once cleaned the rectory, remembered where Edward kept a spare key. Inside, the office was meticulously organized, with shelves lined with religious texts and ceremonial objects. On the desk sat the leather-bound journal. Helen's hands trembled as she opened it, flipping through pages filled with Edward's flowing handwriting. The entries detailed his fire rituals, often referring to sacrifices made in the name of purification. One entry, dated the night Elaine disappeared, confirmed her worst fears. Edward had written about a final offering to cleanse the church of its impurities. Though he did not mention Elaine by name, the timing and description were unmistakable. As Helen photographed the journal's pages, A noise in the hallway made her heart stop. Someone was approaching. She and Anna quickly extinguished their flashlights, hiding behind the desk as the door creaked open. A shadowy figure entered, pausing as if sensing their presence. The moment stretched unbearably, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Just as Helen thought they would be discovered, the figure turned and left, locking the door behind them. Escaping the rectory was a nerve-wracking ordeal, but Helen and Anna managed to slip away unnoticed. The journal, now in Helen's possession, was the most incriminating evidence yet. It was proof of Edward's rituals and a potential link to Elaine's death. However, Helen knew the battle was far from over. Edward's influence over his congregation and the community meant that exposing him would require more than just evidence. It would take dismantling the facade he had built over years of manipulation. As Helen reviewed the journal that night, one entry stood out. It referred to a location known as the Sacred Grounds, described as a place of ultimate purification. Helen realized this could be where Elaine's remains were hidden. Armed with this knowledge, she prepared to confront the darkness once more, knowing the path ahead would only grow more dangerous. The truth was within reach, but the cost of uncovering it was becoming painfully clear. Helen Porter's discovery of Edward Branston's journal marked a turning point in the investigation. The entries, cryptic and laden with religious fervor, painted a picture of a man who had crossed the boundaries of morality in his pursuit of purification. Among the many disturbing passages, the repeated mention of the sacred grounds stood out. Described as a place of ultimate spiritual cleansing, it was clear this location held significance to Edward's twisted rituals. Helen suspected it might also be the key to uncovering Elaine Branston's fate. The journal entries detailed how Edward had taken his most loyal followers to this site for ceremonies that he claimed brought them closer to divinity. While the exact location was not explicitly stated, the description suggested it was a remote clearing in the forest surrounding Ashwood Falls. Helen immediately shared her findings with Detective Marcus Grayson. Armed with this new evidence, Marcus secured a warrant to search the church grounds and the surrounding area thoroughly. The search began at dawn, with a team of officers combing through the dense forest behind the church. Helen, invited to observe from a distance, watched as they navigated the thick underbrush, guided by Edward's descriptions in the journal. Hours passed without any significant discoveries, the forest seemingly reluctant to give up its secrets. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, one of the officers stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the woods. Following the path, the team arrived at a secluded clearing. At its center stood a large stone circle, partially obscured by moss and vines. Surrounding it were remnants of burned wood and melted wax, evidence of fires that had been lit repeatedly over time. The ground was unnaturally disturbed, patches of earth appearing freshly turned despite the site's apparent abandonment. The air was heavy with an acrid smell, faint but unmistakable. The stone circle was immediately cordoned off, and forensic experts were called to examine the site. Using ground-penetrating radar, they quickly identified anomalies beneath the soil. Digging cautiously, the team uncovered charred bone fragments intermingled with ash. It was clear that this site had been used for ritualistic burnings, but the fragmented remains made it difficult to identify whether they belonged to humans or animals. The forensic team began cataloging the evidence meticulously, aware of its potential importance to the case. As the investigation progressed, Helen's role became increasingly precarious. Her articles and discoveries had drawn national attention, putting her at odds with Edward's loyal followers. Anonymous threats began flooding her inbox, warning her to abandon her pursuit of the truth. Helen, however, refused to be intimidated. She believed the growing scrutiny of Edward's actions might pressure someone within the church to come forward with additional information. Her persistence paid off when an anonymous letter arrived at her doorstep. Written in shaky handwriting, it claimed to be from a member of Edward's inner circle. The letter provided specific details about one of the rituals conducted at the sacred grounds, describing how participants were blindfolded and forced to chant as Edward performed the offering. The author also mentioned seeing Elaine the night she disappeared, escorted into the forest by Edward and two other church members. Though the letter stopped short of confirming Elaine's death, it strongly suggested that the sacred grounds were her final destination. Helen immediately shared the letter with Detective Grayson, who had forensic handwriting experts analyze it. While the results were inconclusive, The details aligned with what had already been uncovered, lending credibility to the account. Grayson intensified the investigation, focusing on identifying the two church members mentioned in the letter. Through interviews with former congregants and a review of church records, the police identified potential suspects: Samuel Abbott, a longtime elder of the church, and Diane Keller, a devoted follower known for her unwavering loyalty to Edward. Both Samuel and Diane were brought in for questioning. Samuel, a reserved man in his late 60s, denied any involvement, claiming ignorance of Edward's secret rituals. Diane, however, displayed visible signs of distress during her interview. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small cross, and her eyes darted nervously whenever Elaine's name was mentioned. When pressed, she admitted to being present at several rituals, but insisted she had never witnessed anything violent. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis of the bone fragments recovered from the sacred grounds revealed a partial DNA match to Elaine Branston. The results, though not definitive, were enough to escalate the case. Faced with mounting evidence, Diane broke down during a subsequent interrogation. She confessed to helping Edward restrain Elaine on the night of the final ritual, describing how Elaine had begged for her life as Edward proclaimed her impure. Diane claimed she had been coerced, fearing Edward's wrath and the supposed divine punishment he often invoked. Diane's confession corroborated much of what Helen and the investigators had pieced together. She revealed that after Elaine's death, Edward had ordered the sacred grounds to be abandoned, instructing his followers to remain silent about what had occurred. The confession also implicated Samuel, who was brought back in for further questioning. Confronted with Diane's testimony, Samuel admitted to assisting Edward in disposing of Elaine's remains, though he continued to deny any direct involvement in her death. Edward, however, remained defiant. When police arrived at the church to arrest him, he stood before his congregation, delivering a fiery sermon about persecution and martyrdom. His followers, some in tears, encircled him in a show of solidarity, delaying the officer's approach. It took hours to disperse the crowd, and even then, Edward maintained his composure as he was led away in handcuffs. To his loyalists, he was a wrongfully accused man, targeted for his faith. To the investigators, he was a manipulative figure who had weaponized religion to justify his crimes. As Edward sat in custody, refusing to cooperate, the investigation turned to the remaining members of his inner circle. Detectives worked tirelessly to unravel the network of complicity that had enabled his reign of terror. Each revelation painted a darker picture of a man who had not only orchestrated Elaine's death, but had likely harmed others in his quest for control and power. Helen, though relieved that justice was finally within reach, felt the weight of the journey she had undertaken. Elaine Branston's story was no longer just about one woman's disappearance. It was a testament to the dangers of unchecked authority and blind devotion. The sacred grounds had given up their secrets, but the battle to hold Edward accountable was far from over. The truth, Helen realized, was not just a weapon, it was a light piercing the darkness that Edward had so carefully cultivated. As Edward Branston sat in custody, the investigation into his dark practices intensified. Despite the evidence mounting against him, Edward remained composed, weaving his narrative of persecution with calm defiance. His loyal followers rallied outside the police station, praying and protesting, further complicating efforts to unravel the truth. For Helen Porter and Detective Marcus Grayson, the case had become a high-stakes battle, not just for justice, but for control of the narrative surrounding Elaine Branston's disappearance. Detective Grayson shifted his focus to the inner circle of Edward's church. Diane Keller's confession had shed light on their complicity, but gaps in her story suggested she might be holding back. Grayson ordered a second search of the church and its associated properties, targeting areas Diane had mentioned in her testimony. Teams of officers scoured the sanctuary, rectory, and sacred grounds, uncovering more disturbing details. Among them were ceremonial robes stained with ash and blood, and a collection of burnt artifacts consistent with the rituals Edward had described in his journal. Forensic experts continued their work on the remains found at the sacred grounds. A breakthrough came when advanced DNA testing confirmed the bone fragments matched Elaine Branston's profile with near certainty. This finding, paired with Diane's admission, solidified the case against Edward. However, Grayson knew that to secure a conviction, they needed more, something indisputable that would dismantle Edward's web of lies and sever his grip on his followers. Meanwhile, Helen received another anonymous letter, This time, the sender provided a chilling account of Elaine's final hours, claiming to have witnessed Edward forcing Elaine into the ritual against her will. The letter described Elaine's resistance, her pleas for mercy, and Edward's cold proclamation that her death was a necessary sacrifice. The letter ended with an ominous warning. "There are others buried deeper. Keep digging." Helen shared the letter with Grayson, who immediately ordered ground-penetrating radar to be used at the sacred grounds and other sites linked to the church. The search yielded horrifying results. Beneath the stone circle, investigators found additional remains, some too deteriorated to identify. In the woods surrounding the church, they discovered shallow graves containing the remnants of former congregants who had disappeared over the years. The pattern was clear. Elaine was not Edward's first victim. The investigation reached a fever pitch when police uncovered financial records linking Edward to payments made to silence former members of the congregation. These records, hidden in a locked safe within the rectory, detailed payouts to families who had questioned the disappearance of their loved ones. The documents also revealed Edward's embezzlement of church funds, which he had used to finance the renovations that concealed his crimes. Confronted with this new evidence, Diane Keller broke under pressure. She revealed that Edward had instructed her and Samuel Abbott to dispose of Elaine's belongings, burn her body, and scatter the ashes. Diane also named another key accomplice, Jonathan Mills, a young, impressionable follower who had acted as Edward's enforcer during the rituals. Jonathan, unlike Diane and Samuel, had not yet been located. Finding Jonathan became a priority. Grayson issued an alert, and officers combed through records and interviews to track him down. Helen, unable to sit idly by, used her network of contacts to assist in the search. Her efforts led her to an old acquaintance of Jonathan's, who mentioned seeing him at a rural cabin outside town. Grayson immediately dispatched a team to the location. The raid on the cabin was tense. Officers surrounded the property, armed with warrants and prepared for resistance. Inside, they found Jonathan, disheveled and agitated, attempting to burn what appeared to be journals and photographs. He was subdued and taken into custody, but the partially destroyed materials he left behind revealed more horrifying details about Edward's rituals. Among them was a photograph of Elaine, blindfolded and kneeling at the sacred grounds, flanked by Edward and two other members of the inner circle. In custody, Jonathan was less composed than Edward. Under intense interrogation, he confessed to his role in the rituals, describing how Edward had manipulated him into believing that the sacrifices were divinely ordained. Jonathan confirmed that Elaine had tried to escape the night of her death, but was overpowered and dragged to the sacred grounds. His testimony painted Edward as a man who preyed on fear and devotion, bending his followers to his will through psychological torment and promises of salvation. With Jonathan's confession, the case against Edward became airtight. The police reconstructed Elaine's final hours with chilling precision. She had confronted Edward about his financial and spiritual corruption, threatening to expose him. In response, Edward branded her a threat to the church's purity and orchestrated her death as a demonstration of his power. The rituals, far from being acts of faith, were a means to control and silence dissent. As the trial approached, Helen found herself at the center of a media storm. Her reporting had not only brought Elaine's story to light, but also exposed the systemic abuse within Edward's church. She received both praise and threats, but her resolve remained unshaken. She knew the battle for justice was far from over. Edward, ever the manipulator, used his time in custody to rally his remaining followers. He released statements through his lawyer, portraying himself as a martyr persecuted for his faith. His loyalists held vigils outside the courthouse, their chants echoing the rhetoric he had instilled in them. But as the evidence against him mounted, cracks began to appear in his following. Some members, confronted with the overwhelming proof of his crimes, began to question their allegiance. For Helen and Detective Grayson, the case was a testament to the resilience of truth. The investigation had unearthed horrors beyond what either of them had anticipated, but it had also revealed the strength of those who dared to speak out. Elaine Branston's story, though tragic, became a rallying cry for justice, shining a light on the darkness that had consumed the Ashwood Baptist Church. With the trial looming, Helen knew the fight was not yet over. Edward Branston's influence was waning, but his ability to manipulate and deceive was formidable. The courtroom would become the final battleground, where the truth would face its ultimate test. The trial of Edward Branston began under a heavy cloud of anticipation and tension. The courtroom was packed with spectators, former congregants, journalists, and townsfolk who had once trusted Edward as their spiritual leader. Outside, his remaining loyal followers gathered in protest, their chants echoing faintly through the walls. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Edward maintained his calm demeanor, projecting the image of a persecuted man of faith. For Helen Porter, seated quietly in the gallery, the proceedings marked the culmination of months of relentless investigation and personal risk. The prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. They began by laying out the forensic evidence, starting with the remains recovered from the sacred grounds. Expert witnesses testified that the DNA of the charred bone fragments matched Elaine Branston's genetic profile. The fragments were shown to have been exposed to extreme heat, consistent with the fire pit described by multiple witnesses. Photographs from Helen's investigation were also entered into evidence. The images of the underground purification chamber, the scorched stone slab, and the incriminating entries in Edward's journal painted a grim picture of the rituals that had taken place under his direction. The journal itself, painstakingly analyzed by handwriting experts, was presented as Edward's own admission of guilt. Each entry, filled with religious rhetoric and references to sacrifices, was read aloud, sending a ripple of unease through the courtroom. The most damning evidence came in the form of testimonies from Edward's former inner circle. Diane Keller, pale and visibly shaken, recounted the events leading to Elaine's death. She described how Edward had branded Elaine as impure and ordered her to be brought to the sacred grounds. Diane's voice trembled as she admitted her role in restraining Elaine, her guilt palpable as she described the ritual in horrifying detail. Her confession corroborated Jonathan Mill's testimony, which followed hers. Jonathan, though less composed, confirmed Diane's account, adding that Edward had referred to Elaine's death as a necessary cleansing. The defense attempted to discredit the witnesses, painting them as disgruntled former followers seeking revenge. Edward's lawyer argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the rituals, while unconventional, were symbolic acts of faith rather than acts of violence. They claimed the remains at the sacred grounds could not be conclusively identified as human, despite the prosecution's forensic evidence. Edward, when called to the stand, delivered a calculated testimony, casting himself as a misunderstood leader targeted for his beliefs. His composed demeanor rattled some observers, but Helen saw through the facade. The prosecution countered with the financial records recovered from Edward's safe. These documents exposed his embezzlement of church funds and payments made to silence families of former congregants. The records, paired with witness testimonies, revealed a pattern of manipulation and control that extended beyond the spiritual realm. Edward's church had been a front for his personal gain, and Elaine's attempt to expose him had sealed her fate. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted to the psychological impact of Edward's actions. A clinical psychologist testified about the methods Edward used to control his followers, describing how he exploited their fears and devotion to maintain his authority. The testimony was supported by statements from former congregants who described being manipulated into silence and complicity. Their accounts painted Edward not as a martyr, but as a predator who weaponized faith to serve his twisted agenda. Throughout the trial, Helen found herself reliving the events that had brought her to this point. Each testimony, each piece of evidence was a reminder of the horrors she had uncovered and the risks she had taken to bring them to light. She thought often of Elaine, imagining the fear and betrayal she must have felt in her final moments. It was this image that drove Helen to ensure the truth was heard, no matter the cost. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced the anonymous letters Helen had received during her investigation. Handwriting analysis linked the letters to Diane Keller, who admitted under cross-examination that she had written them out of guilt and fear. The letters, combined with her testimony, provided a chilling account of Elaine's final hours. They described how Elaine had pleaded for her life, her cries drowned out by the chanting of Edward's followers as he carried out the ritual. The details were harrowing, leaving an indelible mark on everyone in the courtroom. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor emphasized the weight of the evidence against Edward. He spoke of Elaine's courage in standing up to her husband and the tragedy of her death at the hands of a man she had once trusted. He urged the jury to see through Edward's veneer of piety and hold him accountable for his crimes. The defense, in contrast, continued to frame Edward as a victim of religious persecution, insisting there was no definitive proof of his direct involvement in Elaine's death. The jury deliberated for 3 days, their decision weighed down by the complexity and gravity of the case. Outside the courthouse, tensions ran high as Edward's supporters clashed with protesters demanding justice for Elaine. Helen stayed close to the courthouse, awaiting the verdict with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he announced the verdict. Guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, and embezzlement. Edward Branston's composure faltered for the first time, his calm mask cracking as he was led away in handcuffs. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but Helen felt only a profound sense of relief. Justice, though delayed, had been served. As the crowd dispersed, Helen stepped outside into the cool evening air. The protesters had begun to disperse, their chants replaced by quiet conversations and solemn reflections. For Helen, the trial was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the cost of uncovering the truth. Elaine's story had been heard, her memory vindicated, but the scars left behind by Edward's actions would linger in Ashwood Falls for years to come. In the days that followed, Helen reflected on her journey. She had faced threats, isolation, and fear, but she had also witnessed the resilience of those who refused to be silenced. Elaine Branston's life had been cut short, but her legacy endured as a beacon of courage and justice. Helen vowed to continue telling stories like hers, shining a light on the darkness that so often goes unseen. The conviction of Edward Branston marked the end of a harrowing chapter in the history of Ashwood Falls. Yet for the community and those directly affected by his actions, the trial's conclusion was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing and understanding. As the courtroom lights dimmed and the public's focus shifted, the scars left by Edward's manipulations lingered, serving as both a painful reminder and a call to action. Helen Porter, whose relentless pursuit of the truth had been instrumental in unraveling the case, reflected deeply on the events that had unfolded. Elaine Branston's tragic death was not just the story of one woman suffering at the hands of a controlling figure. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith, unchecked authority, and the power of collective fear. Through her writing, Helen sought to ensure that Elaine's story would not be forgotten, transforming her blog into a platform for advocacy and awareness. The dismantling of the Ashwood Baptist Church exposed the full extent of Edward's abuses. Investigators uncovered years of financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and coercive rituals that preyed on vulnerable individuals. Former congregants, once too afraid to speak out, began sharing their experiences, shedding light on the pervasive culture of fear Edward had cultivated. Their stories revealed the profound impact of his control, from fractured families to emotional scars that would take years to heal. For the town of Ashwood Falls, the revelations brought about a painful reckoning. The church, once a symbol of unity and faith, now stood as a reminder of the darkness that had festered within its walls. The sacred grounds were cordoned off indefinitely, the stone circle dismantled, and the land declared off limits. A small memorial to Elaine was erected at the site, bearing the inscription, "In memory of those silenced, may their truth bring justice and light." Helen continued her work, dedicating herself to raising awareness about the signs of manipulative leaders and toxic religious practices. She collaborated with psychologists, legal experts, and survivors to create educational content aimed at helping others recognize and resist coercion. Through public speaking events, articles, and documentaries, she highlighted the importance of questioning authority and protecting personal autonomy, even within trusted institutions. One of the most powerful lessons Helen emphasized was the importance of vigilance and community. Edward's power had thrived in the shadows, enabled by silence and the reluctance of those around him to challenge his authority. By sharing Elaine's story, Helen hoped to empower individuals to speak out against injustice, no matter how daunting the opposition. For Detective Marcus Grayson, the case was a reminder of the complexities of human behavior and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. In a rare public statement, he commended the bravery of those who had come forward, acknowledging that their courage had been the linchpin of the investigation. He also called for greater oversight of religious institutions, advocating for reforms that would protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation under the guise of faith. Diane Keller, now serving a reduced sentence for her cooperation, expressed remorse for her role in Elaine's death. Through a letter released to the public, she described the psychological grip Edward had held over her and how fear had blinded her to the harm she was enabling. Her admission served as both a cautionary tale and a plea for forgiveness, sparking discussions about accountability and redemption within the community. As the dust settled, Elaine Branston's legacy began to take shape. A foundation was established in her name, dedicated to supporting survivors of cults and religious abuse. The foundation provided resources for legal assistance, therapy, and education, becoming a lifeline for those seeking to rebuild their lives after escaping similar situations. Elaine's artwork, once a fixture of the Ashwood Baptist Church, was preserved and displayed in a local gallery, a testament to her creativity and resilience. The case also sparked national conversations about the balance between religious freedom and accountability. Advocacy groups and lawmakers began pushing for policies that would increase transparency and oversight in religious organizations, aiming to prevent future abuses of power. While the road to reform was long, the dialogue ignited by Elaine's story marked a crucial step forward. For Helen, the journey was far from over. She continued to write, not just about Elaine, but about others whose voices had been silenced by fear and oppression. Each story was a reminder of the strength it took to confront darkness and the profound impact of truth in the face of deceit. Though the weight of what she had uncovered never truly left her, Helen found solace in knowing that her work had made a difference. The community of Ashwood Falls slowly began to rebuild, its residents finding strength in one another as they worked to heal from the trauma inflicted by Edward's reign. The scars remained, but so did the lessons. The town learned the importance of vigilance, accountability, and the courage to speak out against wrongdoing, no matter how deeply rooted it seemed. Elaine Branston's life had been taken too soon, but her story had become a catalyst for change. Through her memory, others found their voice, and a community learned to stand united against the forces that sought to divide and exploit it. In the end, the light of truth had prevailed, illuminating the path forward and ensuring that Elaine's legacy would endure as a beacon of hope and justice. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.